Friends, good evening. Thank you so much for being here, joining us at Central Synagogue for our evening of learning, of community, of being together. If you haven't already, please help yourselves to the coffee, the tea, and the water. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm Director of Jewish Culture and Programming here at Central. And it is both an honor and a pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Rabbi, Dr. Provost Andrea Weiss is one of my favorite teachers. Rabbi Weiss is the co-editor of the Torah, a Women's Commentary. She is a scholar of the Bible. She is a human of really the first rate. And when I was her student 8 years ago, in 2016, Rabbi Weiss met the unexpected results of our election with determination and with vision. We went into that day, all of us, most of America really, thinking that the results were going to be different than what they were. And Rabbi Weiss returned to our community and to the wider world with a plan of how we could shape the next 4 years through messages of importance to our elected leaders, reminding them who we are as Americans, what we believe in, and what binds us all together. And so tonight we get to hear about that project, the American Values and Religious Voices Project, the legacy of that project, and you all get to learn from one of my very favorite teachers. So together, let's welcome Rabbi Andrea Weiss.
Thank you, Rabbi Berman. So it's really wonderful to be here. We planned this many months ago, in advance of obviously the election, not knowing the outcome. So I'm really delighted to be able to be here to share, as Rabbi Berman said, a project that grew out of, as I'll tell you the story, the 2016 election. So it feels a little bit like deja vu all over again. But I want to tell this story also with a sense of the lessons that it can, I think, offer us now as we're 8 years later and we're looking ahead to the start of another Trump presidency. So this, I'm going to share the story of how this project came about, and then we'll do a little study together and have time for questions. I'm also, and if you want to raise a question as we're going along, that's fine too. So I'm going to tell you the story of this project called American Values, Religious Voices, 100 Days, 100 Letters. This is our website, which is still active, and I hope afterwards you'll noodle around and explore this a little bit. I want to give a little bit of background first of how the project all started. But first, a little personal background that'll help explain it. I live in the Philadelphia suburbs in Bala Cynwyd, for anyone who's from I see a lot of nodding heads. So, which means I live in a swing state. And so unlike, I'm a native San Diegan, spent the first half of my life in California. So unlike all of my family in California, and I work in New York, so my coworkers, it's a thing to live in a swing state and I think every election is a big deal and everyone feels the anxiety of it, but even more so I have found since I have lived in a swing state. So that's a little bit of the background there, a little bit about me. And so I want to start the story with the Thursday after the election in 2016. And I went this is the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, on West 4th and Broadway. And I was teaching a class that year, at that time with my colleague, Dr. Lisa Grant, and we were teaching a class called Teaching Bible to Adults. And the lesson that we had planned for the day was on the biblical text about eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And we decided to scrap the lesson plan and instead share with our students the text that we were thinking about 2 days after the election. And so we shared different texts, but for me, as a Bible scholar, texts from the Bible that I was drawing upon. And we said to our students, this is why the work that they do as students preparing to become rabbis, cantors, Jewish educators matters, so that we can draw upon this rich legacy and heritage that we have of wisdom and insight, particularly when we most need guidance and insight and inspiration. And so I had that in mind when, so this was the Thursday after. The next day, as I was walking my dog, and I was thinking about both the importance of our religious texts at this moment, and also throughout the campaign had really felt this sense of, watching in 2016 as the campaign unfolded, the sense that so many of the core American values that I had always taken for granted seemed to be called into question, if not upended. And so many of those values are rooted in our shared religious traditions. So with those thoughts in mind, I had the idea, kind of nutty idea, while I was walking my dog the Friday after the election, what if we could get 100 scholars of religion of all different faith traditions to each write a letter, one letter, we'd publish a letter a day for the first 100 days to articulate what are our core American values and the way that they're connected to our different religious traditions. So that was my kind of nutty idea. I have a lot of ideas on any given day, and most of which evaporate as the day goes by. But I walked down the street to my neighbor, Dr. Mark Smith, who's a teacher and mentor of mine. He was at NYU for many years and now at Princeton Theological Seminary. And I knocked on his door and I said, Mark, I have this idea, what do you think? And he said, I think it's a good idea, I'll help you. And I later have said to him, if he had said pretty much anything else besides that, I would have gone home. I had a book I was halfway through that remains half written, and I would have just returned to my book. And that's really, just as an aside, that's real mentorship, right? I had this kind of nutty idea, he encouraged me, and so then the Sunday after the election, I was at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and our beloved president of blessed memory, Aaron Pankin, we had a symposium, and I went to President Pankin and I said, Aaron, I have this idea. I think I'll need a website, maybe a student intern. Maybe it'll cost $5,000. Could you give me some money to do this project? And he thought about it and came back the next day and he said, yes, I'll support you. And because I got everything pro bono, actually, that's about what it ended up costing. So with that, I then contacted one of my oldest friends from when I moved to Philadelphia to go to Penn to get my PhD, Lisa Weinberger, who has she's a graphic designer with a design and branding studio, amazing person and professional. And so I sent her out of the blue, you can see this number, November 16th, we're about a week after the election, and I sent her this email. You can see the subject is 2 questions. One, will you watch my dog? You're going to see the dog kind of runs throughout. And the other one, I said, I have this idea, kind of gave the background of it. You can see at the time I tentatively titled it, Scripture Teaches 100 Days, 100 Scholars of the Book. You'll see we came up with a better title. And I figured I would need maybe some graphic. I didn't even know. I wasn't on social media. I didn't quite know what I was asking. And I say now, if I knew what I was asking of her, even I wouldn't have had the chutzpah to ask. But since I didn't know quite what it would involve, I asked. And the next day, she wrote back the following: I'm in for both. And she later told me, I said once as the project unfolded and it became clear what the whole project involved from her and from her whole staff to make this project happen. I said, Lisa, I didn't know what I was asking, but you knew what you were saying yes to. Why did you do that? And she said, after the election, she had a hole in her heart. And she thought, what could she do as a graphic designer that would make a difference in the world? And here, out of the blue, my email ended up in her inbox asking her and providing a way for her to give of her personal, professional resources to try to do something to make a difference and try to contribute something positive in the world. And that's why she said yes. So with that, a few days later, I headed off to San Antonio for the annual Society of Biblical Literature American Academy of Religion conference. This year it's in San Diego, convenient for me since I can visit my family. I'm heading there on Friday. So this is a huge conference with Bible scholars and scholars of religion of all different faiths. So another thing about my background, I'm a Bible professor. My field is Hebrew Bible. I teach at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. I went to the university. My PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied with predominantly Jewish professors, Jewish classmates. So I'm not exactly the right person to take on a big multi-faith project, since I didn't at the time have a lot of connections. But I went to this conference with a notebook, and everyone I ran into on the elevator, in a bar, anywhere. I went to sessions that I don't usually go to try to see, and I'd ask everyone, I had this idea, what do you think? Would you want to write a letter? Do you know of someone who might want to write a letter? And so I left the conference with a list of people, and I then put together an advisory committee. So it was myself, Mark Smith, Deirdre Good, who's a New Testament scholar. Hussein Rashid was just someone I called. Elsie Stern in the middle bottom. We've been friends from summer camp at Camp Swig in California. She's a Bible scholar and at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And then Herbert Marbury, who I sat next to at a session at the conference and told about and recruited for the project. So I knew I would need a diverse group to help design the project. And so we put together, the six of us created a basic vision of how the project would work. And you can see on December 2nd, we sent the letter, and we sent the first batch to about 100 people initially. And you can see what we asked for them. We asked, what passages from your religious tradition have you been thinking about in the wake of the election? What issues most concern you, and how does your religious heritage speak to those concerns? What message rooted in the texts you study and teach would you most like to deliver to our national leaders and to a wider interfaith audience, many of whom long for guidance, inspiration, and a reaffirmation of what it means to be an American? So that was the ask. As an academic, you get asked to do a lot of things. Will you write a chapter for this? Will you write an article for this? And most of the time you end up, saying no because a lot of people are overcommitted. But my sense on this was, one, both that it was short enough that people would say yes, and that people were looking for a way to contribute something positive. And so we sent out the letters, and we had 50 days, exactly 50 days from that date, from December 2nd until January 20th, which was day one. That was the inauguration day. And over those 50 days, I sent out 180 invitations. I had lists all over the place, both that I was tracking to make sure how many Jewish people, Christians of varied denominations, et cetera, and who said yes, and nudging people. And finally, on the inauguration day, I got my 100th person to say yes. And the whole time, you can see Lisa was developing the visual identity for the project. We had someone who volunteered to create the website. Pretty soon I had a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, none of which I knew what to do at the beginning, but figured that out. She helped me. And along the way, during the 50 days, we would promote when new scholars signed on. We would promote on social media to try to get a sense of a following. And so then finally, on day one, we had the 100 scholars. I'll read, this is from Elsie Stern's letter from day 100, but it gives you a sense of the project and who our contributors were. So Elsie wrote, the American Values Religious Voices letter writers provide a snapshot of the America that you have pledged to serve. We are men and women from red states and blue states. We identify as African American, Asian, Latinx, Native American, and white. We are Buddhists, Christians of varied denominations, Hindus, Jews, and I should add Jews of varied denominations, Muslims, and Sikhs. Some of our families have been in this country since before it was America, others are immigrants ourselves. So that was the whole idea, was to bring together a very diverse group. And when I first had the idea for this project, I had this vision of both if we could, in fact, get these 100 people, I had this vision of being able to put their pictures all on one page. And that's what we did on the website. And you can see just from the visual, these are our 100 scholars, just how diverse the group is. It was really important for me both that we have some very senior Bible scholars as well as young scholars, so really a diverse array of voices. And that's kind of gives you a visual of who the letter writers were. Let me just pause there to see if there are any initial questions.
I'm not quite clear. Did you just...
Okay, so the question was, thank you, I didn't specify this. These were all, thank you for asking the question, these were all scholars of religion. So that was the defining feature. And one of my friends said to me, like, I don't care what Mark Smith has to say, I want to know what my rabbi has to say. I said, well, your rabbi literally has a pulpit. But that was both as a way to create kind of a sense of the group, but I also, my sense on this is that people who are academics, scholars of religion, don't have the same kind of platform, but really had something to say. And that was who we asked. So anyone who has a PhD in some field of religion of some sort.
And I'm going to yes and your answer, because as a clergy student at the time, and then with the letters to the Biden administration as clergy, it's not, we know how to hear from other clergy colleagues. We don't always know how to hear from our teachers once we're in the field. And that's who these scholars of religion are. They are the teachers of clergy.
Yeah, a lot of them are from seminaries. And that was part of it. When you have politicians, this was in my mind, who say I'm a Christian first, but a Republican second, but are promoting policies that seem so against some of our core religious traditions, or in this case, what would call the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament. I wanted to bring scholars to really say this is what those texts say. So that's how we got to that idea of scholars. So that's how we got together the 100 people. So now, how did the campaign work? And I should say all the artwork was produced throughout the campaign from Lisa and the folks at Masters Group Design. I will say I was forever spoiled by working with a graphic designer on a project, because everything looks great. And Lisa's amazing. So what we did, as we started inviting people, I got the letters, and we published them a week at a time. So we had every week, so the inauguration was on a Friday, so every week on the Wednesday, I would make the decision of which letters were going to be in the upcoming week. And then on the Thursday, we would publish a graphic that looked like this, which would give a preview of the upcoming letters. And I originally, when we started the campaign, I had, before the first day, I had about 30 letters. And I thought, okay, and I scheduled them all. I spent a day figuring out, how to make sure every week was diverse. And then the Trump administration took over, and things started happening. There's going to be a Muslim ban or a wall, and I'd say, oh, I have a letter about that, but I was going to put that in day 20. So I ripped up my list and decided I would publish I would decide on which letters to use on any given week so that we could be most responsive to what was unfolding throughout the 100 days. And you can already get a sense here of the diversity of the authors. So this would come out. And then the way that the project worked is that at 5 a.m., the letters would be disseminated in a couple of ways. So one is they would come up on our website. We would have them queued up to go out. And so we had people who subscribed. Anyone by chance a subscriber to the campaign in real time? Rabbi Berman. So, we kind of threw this piece in as we were designing the website. We said, okay, well, let's have people be able to subscribe. Lisa and I felt like if more than just her mother and my mother subscribed, it would be a win. In the end, we had over 2,000 people who were subscribers, and that meant at 5 a.m. in people's inbox, they would get an email that said today's day 1, letter 1 with a link to it. Hold on one sec. So that is one way the letters went out, and the whole time we had both what we called our implicit audience and our explicit audience. So you can see the explicit audience is the president, vice president, and members of the Trump administration and Congress. The way that we got the bulk of that audience was members of Congress. So, and what we did is we bought a list of all the chief of staff and legislative directors of all members of Congress, so the House and the Senate. So that's over 1,000 people who would, and we sent through MailChimp, they would get the letter at 5 a.m. And then so that's our explicit audience. And then we had the implicit audience of all the people who were both got the letters because they were subscribers, or we also posted on social media. So we had, again, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and we would do a quote or a picture, and those went up every day. We had a question here, yeah.
All the letters written in advance of day 1, or did you write them in response to things that were actually happening as the?
So, good question. So I had a bulk that were written in advance, and then others would come in throughout. And in some cases, I had a few people drop out, so even some of the letters were written at the end. And I had all these lists, like every holiday that took place, any religious or national holiday. And so I would schedule, like Valentine's Day, I put, like that week, any letter that I had about love, or President's Day, I clustered that. Passover, I had, so I kind of, some letters that came in early, I saved for later. So that was, and then some some things I evolved. I waited to see when was the best time to put certain letters, depending on the topic. So I mentioned they were sent to the folks in Washington via MailChimp. They went out on our website. And the third way we got the letters is every day I printed out 2 old school, two copies of each letter, one specifically addressed to President Trump and the other to Vice President Pence. And I printed them out and put them in an envelope with an American flag stamp. And this was my dog, Sophie, and we walked to the mailbox every day and mailed the letters. So those were the 3 ways the letters went out. And that was our big focus, editing the letters, getting them on the website, social media, et cetera. And that was our real focus. That was the idea. We were sending letters, getting these letters out. What we didn't expect was how much people were communicating with us and the feedback that we were getting throughout the campaign. So I'll just share a little bit. So, and we would either on social media, or people would text me or send emails with the way that they were responding to the letters as they were unfolding. And so, and I would send it to Lisa, and then she would turn it into art. So this is an example. People wrote to us to say the way that the letters for them became prayers or morning meditation. For a lot of people, because they arrived so early, they were the first thing people read in the morning, and it was just very grounding to see, okay, a reaffirmation of, I'm not wrong to think that we should be kind to other people, or that we should be welcoming to people in need or the stranger, et cetera. So it was very reaffirming. So people described it as a lifeline, an anchor, or a prayer.
Do you have a sense of who that audience was?
Of who our subscribers were?
Or
very diverse. So, people kind of found out by word of mouth. The letter writer shared it. So,
reach out to clergy?
yeah, we did. I mean, there were throughout the campaign, especially at the beginning, we had a lot of ideas of the ways that we would try to get the letters out and get even more support. And at a certain point, we were like the 2 of us, and I had 2 interns, but we were limited to what we can do, so we just relied on kind of ripple effect of people sharing it with other people. But we knew from the analytics of, you can look at the website, how many people opened the letters, that there were thousands of people that were reading them. This is also another I'll share, I think, that captures part of what the project. So this was from a college friend of mine who texted me saying, "I'm loving my daily inspirational letters from voices I'm not accustomed to hearing." And I think that's an important piece of the project, especially in 2016, as one of the lessons I think we learned is, and we heard the phrase a lot about people being siloed. And so the idea that we were hearing from other people. I had, through those 100 days, this stack in my office of, I had a New Testament and a Hebrew Bible and a Quran, and I was learning all of these texts that I didn't know before. So it was, so that, this quote, I think, captures that. So I brought a few. So I'm going to preempt the question that I'm sure you're wondering, which is, did anyone in Washington respond? So I'm going to share what happened on day 24. So remember, we're about a quarter of the way in, which, so this was February 12th, which I have to say, around this time, I remember thinking like, wow, we've done, in this case, like 25 letters, and then realizing, that's only we have 75 to go. So if you've ever run a marathon or, it definitely took some stamina. But this day in particular, you're going to see why this February 12th was an important day. And this is around President's Day. So I mentioned that this was one of the fun things about scheduling the letters. So in this case, I took all the letters that I had at that time that mentioned a president, and I put them that week. And this letter was by Brian Massengale. He's at Fordham. And he mentions Lincoln. This was Lincoln's birthday. So that's how I chose it for that date. And I want to read it, and you'll see that this sounds very contemporary. So he begins, "I write this letter as the Trump presidency unfolds with a sense of dread about our nation's future. This anxiety stems not solely from disagreements with proposed policies, but from what this election has revealed about who we are as a nation. The election showed that we are not only deeply divided by fissures of race, class, gender, ethnicity, geography, religion, and sexual identities and expressions, we are also separated by chasms of understanding. Those who differ from us seem increasingly alien and incomprehensible. We have become a nation of strangers, siloed in racial, geographic, media, and even digital enclaves where we most likely interact with those who are like us." And I just want to say that was 2016, and sort of really with this sense as I read this in preparation for tonight, even more so now, 8 years later. So he writes in this, he quotes we asked all the writers to quote primary religious sources. So he quotes, "The sacred texts of Christianity summon us to love our neighbor, care for the stranger, and show one another the compassion we believe God has for us. They bluntly tell us that we are our brothers and sisters' keeper. They warn us that our response to the least among us, those not like us, is the measure of our holiness and righteousness." And then he writes, "Healing our national estrangement, then, is perhaps the greatest challenge facing your presidency. As Abraham Lincoln warned in his 1858 speech to the Illinois Republican State Convention, a house divided against itself cannot stand." And then he concluded his letter. He says, "But this healing will not come from a facile appeals to unity, or even less from a dismissive attitude of we won and get over it. Healing our divisions will come only from a cultivation of public compassion, which at the very least demands respect and decency toward those with whom we disagree." And then he concludes by referring to Pope John Paul II, who declared that one of the most important questions facing society is, how are we living together? And then he wrote, "Together, Mr. Trump, our collective response to that question will depend greatly upon both your compassion for the vulnerable and the quality of your respect for those with whom you disagree." So that was the letter, and you can see, I hear some. So again, you can see these letters are, as I say, we're going to need these letters again, but this still really resonates. So that morning, as I mentioned, the letters came out at 5, and at about 8 in the morning, I see on my phone that I have a response to the MailChimp account, which is the first sign of life I've gotten that anyone who's in Washington who's getting these is reading them. And it turns out I had an email from Catherine McGuire, who was the chief of staff of Randy Holkren, who is a Republican congressman from Illinois. And she wrote, and I was thrilled, you can see it's 9:47. I read your messages. This particular letter had me rejoicing in the author matching scripture to our current divide in our country. And then she writes, then she says, the second paragraph, she writes, however, I found myself deflated and sorely disappointed with the concluding sentence. That's when he writes, together, Mr. Trump. And she said, instead of driving home that we, the nation's people, should do all we can to rise above our current selves and create again the important notion of together, the conclusion seemed to press for a continued divide, laying it at the feet of the divider himself. And she goes on to say, for her, that last sentence undermined the core message in one full swoop. And she's then concluded that I choose to work for the greater good and do all I personally can to be part of the solution, no matter what, rather than be part of the problem. So needless to say, I was thrilled, sign of life. One person, at least, was reading the letters. So I sent it to Professor Massengale, and then he wrote back to her explaining why he had chosen that, and in which case he writes about here, feeling that it's Trump's example and the kind of respect he grants those with whom he disagrees, that he says, for better or worse, the nation takes its cues from his example. We see how that's played out and the truth to that over the last 8 years. And so then she wrote back with a message that really kept us going for the next 76 days. She said, keep the letters coming. People are reading them. They help us make sense of the world we live in today and remind us of the world we want to live in tomorrow. So again, that message kept us going. But that's not the only thing that happened on that day. So on that same day, and you can see this is the example of the way that Lisa and her coworkers would take the letters and make art that we would then use on social media. So this was from on Lincoln's birthday. That same day, I got an email from another Fordham professor, Karina Hogan, who wrote to tell me that day at church, remember that was a Sunday, she said, someone at my church told me today that the letters have opened up a conversation between him and his brother, a Trump supporter who works at Oral Roberts University. And I then she gave me the contact information, and this person who goes to her church wrote back and said, during the campaign, my brother and I stopped speaking. Values and voices created dialogue and healing for me. And that's exactly what we hope the project would accomplish. The idea that we could bridge the divide by being able to find what we have the values that we share in common, and using that as a way to engage in conversation. So these two, this is, I would say, quality, not quantity in terms of the response, but these two responses were affirmation that people were reading the letters and that they were making a difference. That, along with, as I mentioned, the kind of feedback that we were getting quite regularly from folks in a lot of different ways. So, and that kind of got us through. It was a crazy 100-day. My son's bar mitzvah was on day 72, which was another reason that it was a crazy. We then went to Israel during the time. So it was a really nutty, but 100 days, but also really energizing. The response the letters we're getting, and just to be able to see this idea, kind of nutty idea, come to fruition. So that's we had the 100 days. So what happened afterwards? I want to share a few things. So one is that people kept contacting us and kept we're still using the letters. So at the end of May, so this is over a month after the campaign ended, I got an email, you can see here, from a pastor of a Presbyterian church in Auburn, Alabama. And she wrote to me saying that the children in their religious school were reading the letters, and they wanted to know, did anyone respond? So I wrote this. I wanted to bring this in particular because I wrote this. So I went to the same MailChimp account, and I wrote to the chiefs of staff of legislative directors, that same group of over 1,000 people, and the headline was, "Did you read your letters?" And so I asked here, and I share both, because I said here, the kids, not only in Auburn, Alabama, but I said a 7th grade religious school class at a New York City synagogue, that happens to be Central Synagogue. During the campaign, one of the teachers at Central was using the letters with a religious school class. And they also wanted to know, they also contacted me to ask, did anyone write back? So I tried every which way to try to get a response, not all too successfully. But at the end of the 100 days, I had both this treasure of 100 letters, and I also had all of this amazing artwork. And so we continued to put stuff on social media in response to things that were unfolding over the next year or so. And meanwhile, I was busy trying to do what I felt like would be the culmination of the project, which was to get the books published. And HUC has a campus in Cincinnati, and my first visit as I was becoming provost of the Cincinnati campus, the University of Cincinnati was just starting as an academic press, and we had a meeting with them, and just as an introductory meeting, and at the end of the meeting, I said to them, I think I have a book for you. And whipped out my PowerPoint and told them about the project, and so they published it. Sadly, the press just closed 8 years later, but so we published all 100 letters and the artwork and essays, and I was really proud of that, and also dedicated the book to Rabbi Penkin, which also that was important to me. This project, and the reason that he supported it is he really believed in the thought leadership, and that the work that we as faculty do at HUC matters, and the idea that taking scholarship and putting it out into the world matters. So that was it. And I thought this project far exceeded what I could have expected. And I thought that was it. And then 4 years later, and people would ask me, "You're going to do it again?" I said, "No." At this point, had become provost and was busier than I had been when I had done it 4 years before. And then we found ourselves, if you recall, though, in 2020, waiting what was going to be the result of the election. And I thought to myself, okay, we're in a pandemic. We've had the racial reckoning. Our country is clear, whatever was going to be the result of the election, our country was clearly more divided than ever. And I thought to myself, I have a letter I want to write, and I think people need the letters again. But I knew I couldn't do it by myself. So I called my daughter, Rebecca Tauber, who at the time was a senior at Williams College and editor of her newspaper. And as I say, kind of by nature and nurture, she's an editor. In fact, she just recently got a new job as a editor and writer on The Athletic. So that's an exciting career move for her. So I called her and I said, Rebecca, would you be my editorial assistant? And do you think you could get some friends to do the social media? Because I couldn't quite ask Lisa again to give of herself and in the same way. So by the end of the afternoon, Rebecca had recruited two of her friends. So this is our Williams College campaigns staff. And because this was now 2020, so because of COVID, their semester ended early. They started late in February, so they had the time. And that's how we made it happen. On January 5th, we sent out the announcements that we were going to launch the campaign again. Thankfully, we sent it on January 5th and not on January 6th. And we on December 2nd, so exactly 4 years later, I wrote to the 100 people who had contributed the first time, basically dusted off almost the same letter that I had sent 4 years ago and asked people to contribute. And on that same day, a quarter, so 25 of our original letter writers wrote back that same day, which academics are not so great at responding to email, and they said, yes, I'm in, thank you for doing this again. And in the end, we had about 50 returning letter writers and about 50 new writers. And because I had my young, amazing group of college interns, and it was 4 years later, and we had an expanded sense of what diversity means. So we were looking at things like, well, what kind of colleges? Do we have colleges in rural areas? Do we have community college professors? And we really tried to bring in new voices as we put together, and we went through the exact same process to get the 100 letters. So on some sense, it was the same, except for this time I learned my lesson. The letters went out at 6 a.m., not 5 a.m., so I wasn't getting up at 4 something every day to make sure everything worked. So you'll notice 4 years later, we have a new dog. This is Jordy. Sophie had passed away. So we did, the campaign ran exactly the same way, the letters going out on MailChimp, and on our account, we increased our subscribers, and every day Jordy and I mailed the letters. But there were some new features because, first of all, again, I had a thanks to the savvy of my college interns, and also we were in COVID. So I feel like this picture, the idea that, you kind of date it, like we have all gotten used to seeing people, again, this is 2021, seeing people's in their home, but we asked people to record them reading the letters, and it really brought the letters to write. I think over half the letter writers either gave audio or recorded themselves on Zoom. We have on YouTube, we have a Values and Voices channel, so you can go in and actually hear the letter writers reading their letters. And as soon as it launched, in the upper left-hand corner, that's David Bradley. He's an activist and active in a lot of the arts in Philadelphia, and he wrote and he said, I can hear these letters being sung, I could hear these letters being read, and we put together this Zoom project. We had several hundred people who came. It was on President's Day, and we recruited actors and songwriters. We had our local congressman there too, so we had actors who read, we had a selection of letters. We also had a couple of songwriters who took the letters and were inspired and wrote original compositions. So we'll hear one. So this is one, Keisha Hutchins Herlinger. And so we're gonna play a little bit of her song now. And this, as you can see, she took a couple of the letters, and this is the song she created. We'll hear a bit of this.
I woke up breathless in my dream. We were running, chasing something that can't be denied. And I knew in that moment I was glad you were with me, 'cause I knew this chase could change the tide. You said, be courageous, be strong, but most of all, be kind. You stood beside me in that moment. Your freedom was bound up in mine. We all bound up in you, bound up in me. We all bound, born of one truth that sets us free. We all bound up in you, bound up in me. We all bound, born of one truth that sets us free. We all bound. After justice, we must chase if we are to ever survive this place. By cherishing you, I'm cherishing me, and all of your love has taught me to see. I must break open my heart. You break open yours too.
that give you a sense, and I think the message of we are bound, and that was an important part of the project. One of the things that we heard both in 2017, again in 2021, but was that the letters made people feel like they weren't alone, and the way that they brought people together, both the letter writers, the letter readers as a community. And we had a number of we knew the way people were using the letters. Clergy were reading them in worship services and using them in interfaith groups. And so in this idea of we are bound, the project helped to bring people together. We had another Zoom for Women's History Month where we brought together a number of the women letter writers, of which about half of the letters were written by women and reflected particularly on that aspect, which was a neat part of the project. And we also, toward the end of the campaign, we had an article in the Washington Post. And I'll add that in the first campaign, early on, I was contacted by the New York Times, and this is in 2017, and they sent over a reporter and a photographer and took pictures of me walking my dog and mailing the letters, and so that was probably like day 20-something. So the whole campaign, I kept waiting. When is this article going to come out in the New York Times? Never came out. As you might recall, there's a lot of stuff going on, and this didn't quite surface. That was definitely a disappointment because I felt like that. So someone asked about how did people hear about the project. I felt like if we could get media coverage, that would help. When we did the project the second time, we had someone who volunteered who's a media person, and so we did, and we had much greater media coverage. We were in the BBC, we were in a number of different newspapers, but the culmination and the thing that I was really pleased with was this really great article that was in the Washington Post. And what was neat about this is that they contacted, because this was the one Washington DC writer who had written in 2017 but wasn't signed up to be in 2021. But I had someone drop out of the campaign shortly before the article came out, and she ended up writing one of the very last letters. So that I was really pleased with, felt like it got its due. And then the question, if you're asking again, did anyone write back? Several months after the campaign ended, I came to my office at HUC because HUC's address was what we used, and I had a stack of all the exact same form letters from the office of the vice president, which meant that someone in the vice president's office got all of my handwritten, or out of my, the letters that I printed and sent, and wrote the exact same form letter. But at least I knew someone in the White House was reading the letters. And again, that's, and the project then culminated with the publication of our second volume, which we titled Letters of Hope from People of Faith. And again, it had the letters, and we also had different essays to go along with it. So I want to share one other avenue that the project took. So again, with the publication of the book, I thought, okay, that's it. And one of the just tremendous pleasures and privileges of my job is that I also work with our Israeli rabbinical program. So we have a beautiful Jerusalem campus, and we have an amazing Israeli rabbinical program. We just ordained last Friday 7 new amazing Reform rabbis in Israel. And so in 2022, I landed in Israel the day after the election, the Israeli election that put Netanyahu in power. It felt like 2016, the day after the election there. And we had already scheduled, because we knew I was giving a lunch and learn to the Israeli rabbinic students, and we knew no matter what was going to happen, it was going to be in between the Israeli election and our midterm election in 2022. So I told all about the project, and one student came up to me afterwards. She said, "You created something out of nothing." And I said, "Yeah, that's it." And she was so taken by the project that she ended up with her husband, who's a computer guy, with just the two of them together, created Israeli Values, Religious Voices, where what they did is they, in advance of Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day that year, Israel's 75th anniversary, they got 75 people, all diverse group of letter writers, and they wrote a letter a day, which they published on their website in Arabic and in Hebrew, and we're working on a translation. And those are all available on the website, Israeli Values, Religious Voices. So that was a neat offshoot of the project. And so between that and the publication of the book, that's where the project has come to a conclusion. But I want to share, we have a little bit of time left, what I hope are some takeaways. And we don't have time to read the letters now, but you can take them home with you. I feel like the letters are kind of like children. You're not supposed to have favorites, but I do have a few favorites that have really stuck with me. This is a letter from Mark Bretler, and I want to share this section that in part of his letter that really, I think, encapsulates for me what motivated me to this project, and I think it should be motivation for all of us. And he starts by talking about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, so he's using that. He says that story embeds two complementary notions: that a small number of individuals can make change and thereby save an entire community, and that if decent individuals do not succeed in transforming their community, they are all culpable. And he writes then a little further on in the letter, he writes, this biblical passage should make us more aware that as individuals, whether private citizens or public officials, we are each responsible for the members of the larger community and polity. Standing idly by or arguing that someone else should step up is not an option. We are each accountable if we do not work to improve our communities. And this project for me, which, as I mentioned, started as this kind of just a far-fetched idea, became for me a way of stepping up. And I think that the moment then and the moment now demands for us that kind of stepping up. So I want to leave you, we'll take time for questions, but both with that statement from Mark's letter, standing idly by or arguing that someone else should step as not an option, as well as from letter 26, Moralai Balajai, who wrote the question that has also been really central for me throughout these 8 years is, what can we do to create light together, and how bringing people together. And so I'd ask for you, what is your way of stepping up? In what ways will you create light, particularly at a moment where we really need more light in the world? So I'm going to open it up. We have a chance for some questions.
First, thank you so much, Rabbi Weiss. All right, so folks who have questions, look for you to raise your hands. We have a couple of minutes for questions, and then we'll break for the evening, and maybe Rabbi Weiss will be able to take a couple more, possibly, as we come to completion.
You talk about American values and coming from Philadelphia. I hope you realize Benjamin Franklin left Boston because he couldn't stand the Pilgrims, even though he didn't like the Quakers. And James Madison wrote vociferously about how he couldn't stand the Catholics. And you mentioned Abraham Lincoln, 1858, his third Lincoln-Douglas debate. He said if the blacks are given their freedom, they should not be allowed to intermarry, they should not be allowed to vote, and they should leave the country. So there's a mixed record of American values, and I think you ought to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think yes, I think that's right. Other questions or comments?
All right, two on this side.
Thank you. I think it can be very easy to read in biblical text a confirmation of your priors. I think very famously, abolitionists and enslavers would read the same stories and come to different conclusions. When you're trying to get someone to reconsider a prior using biblical text, How can you break through that barrier?
That's a great question. I think a really important point, and we see this in the discourse, and that's also part of the project, because we've tend to seen a more liberal religious voice often hasn't been part of the conversation, and that's part of, I think, a contribution of the project is bringing other voices. And I think another part of this project is that's the focus on scholars who really are able to say, with some sense of authority and authenticity, this is what, at least, this is be able to, with a sense of what the texts say particularly in their particular context. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think that's, part of it is understanding our text, but also coming out, I think it's, Bob, part of your question too, is that these are the Bible doesn't, or any of these religious traditions don't just say one thing, and people often, pick and choose what the messages are. But in this case, there are definitely clear themes that emerge from our religious texts, particularly as they relate to contemporary issues. I'm not sure if that exactly gets to your question, but it's a good question and a good point, so thank you.
Thank you for a very beautiful and moving presentation. I'd like to, I think, amend his question. I've been struck by the analyses of what happened during this election, and everybody seems to talk about the big divide, and also the divide, not just between class and race, but also between the youth and us. And so I'm just wondering, if you were to do this again, or if somebody were to do it again, how would you really expand your audience in ways that to people who are not academically inclined, who don't read this, who maybe get their news from, what's his name, Seth Rogen? It's a whole... Joe, you can tell I don't even know. But the fact that I don't even know is telling. So I think there's a very important message that you have, but I feel I'm really worried about people who are not us.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, when we did the campaign the second time, we really tried to expand both, I think, because I think we had a different sense of what diversity really meant, and again, working with younger people who also brought a heightened sensitivity to that. So we tried to, even for example, in the Jewish scholars, we wanted to have a Jew of color, or different, like Jews who were more diverse. We wanted to make sure that we had, in all ways, a more diverse audience. And I think that's part of that sense of being siloed. How do we break through to share? And part of the diversity, we really tried the second time to also have more political diversity. Interestingly enough, it's easier to see. You can learn a lot about people by, looking them up on their, social media, or on, again, because these are academics, people looking them up at their universities. But it's much harder to know where people fit politically. So we really made an effort to try to ask around to try to have more political diversity. That was harder to do, but that was in terms of who we were asking to write the letters, and then in terms of who to read them. How to get a broader audience. Again, as I mentioned before, we tried as much as possible, and also, one of the things about the project was I felt like. The letters, especially having published them in the books, that they're evergreen in a certain sense of hoping that they would continue to have a life on their own, and even if the original audience was maybe not as vast as we would have hoped as we were dreaming of what this project could be, but that they would continue to find an audience even after the campaigns ended.
So we've come nearly to the end of time. We'll take one more question.
I just wonder if you think, because I think what we have ahead of us is so much worse than it was the last time. I think most of us that do read and have an idea of what's going on in the world. It's a very different electorate. Do you think this project would work, or some version of it, in the next 4 years? God help us.
Hold on one sec. So that's a question I've gotten asked. Am I going to do the project again? And my answer to that is, even if I had the capacity to do it, which I don't, a sad reality of post October 7th is I would not undertake this kind of project. I don't think I would be able to get the coalition or the same gathering, the diverse gathering. I think it would be. I don't think it would be successful. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think certainly, I think in a post-October 7th reality, it's doing this kind of, for right now, doing this kind of multi-faith project, it becomes a lot more complicated. As I say, people can just dust off. A lot of the letters, certainly from the first volume, are still on point, and I think the messages are still there. I want to conclude with a prayer for our country, which is what I had put together, is a compilation of sentences from the different letters that put together as a prayer for our country, and I wanted to end by reading this. Every inch of America is sacred, from sea to shining sea. There is much to be done in our time, the sort of hard work on which God smiles, because it is done for the sake of the dignity and well-being of all God's creatures. Together, let us work to preserve and make manifest the upon which our democracy was founded. The task of all people of faith is to call governing authorities to fulfill God's purpose of bringing about justice, mercy, and peace. Individually and as a nation, may we heed our obligations to each other as we navigate the tensions of building a just society. Rather than a politics of divisiveness, may we move our country towards a politics of empathy. May we use our power well so we do great things for all God's creatures, all those made in God's image who yearn for an equal place at America's table. If we do this, may grace and peace be ours in abundance. May we be a beacon and a blessing to the world.
Amen.
Thank you.